That the membership reservation line is currently inactive, so call the main City Club number, 503-228-7231, for your tickets. And this will fill up, so please make your reservations early. This month, in honor of the American Library Association's Banned Book Week, the City Club Citizens Read will be reading one of the most notorious banned books in American history, Jerome Lawrence and Robert E. Lee's fictionalized account of the John Scopes monkey trial, Inherit the Wind. A special screening of the movie adaptation of Inherit the Wind will be shown at City Club on Thursday evening, October 26 at 7 p.m., and then Citizens Read discussion will be on Monday, October 30. Anyone can come, whether you're a member or not, but please call City Club RSVP so we will know how many people to expect. The book is available in the back. 10% of the proceeds will go towards City Club, so if you'd like to buy one, you can do that today at the conclusion of the program. City Club will host David Callahan, the author of a recently published book, The Moral Center, on October 17 from 5:30 to 7. Larry Wallach, who is from the City Club Board of Governors and the Dean of the College of Urban and Public Affairs at Portland State University, will moderate the discussion. Again, it's open to the public, but we'd ask that you RSVP. And finally, as in years gone past, City Club is selling tickets to Candidates Gone Wild. This year's event, which is sure to be memorable, features the candidates for the Oregon governor and takes place at the Roseland Theater on Monday, October 16. Tickets can be purchased at the registration today at next week's Friday Forum or at the City Club at any time. And details about all these events can be found in your bulletin. They can be found online. And when you're on the line online, you can also learn about the broadcast schedule for radio and television. You can purchase audio and videotapes. We have a number of people here today who we don't regularly see, and we are absolutely delighted to see you all here. We are hoping that some of you will choose to become members of City Club. We would love to have you, and we are making a special offer, and that is the new member registration fee of $25 will be waived today if you decide to join. So we hope you will, and you can sign up at the table on your way out. We are fortunate in Portland to have great corporate citizens who help make these programs possible. Our sponsors this quarter are Barron Liebman LLP and Zimmer Gunsel Frasca Partnership. Would you please join me in thanking our sponsors? Our program today is entitled Restoring Salmon Through Dam Removal. 4 dams on the lower Snake River were constructed to provide hydroelectric power to Idaho, Oregon, and Washington residents. But since the last dam's completion in 1975, the dams have been the subject of controversy. These dams currently submerge about 140 miles of river habitat that, before their construction, served as prime spawning territory for salmon and steelhead populations. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers concluded in a recent report that the region could experience an annual recreational revenue increase of $3 billion from anglers, boaters, and tourists if the dams were removed. However, the National Hydropower Association and others contend that removing the dams is environmentally and economically irresponsible. We have with us today 2 outstanding public servants and old friends who will speak to us about this sensitive and important issue that affects our region, our identity, and our way of life. First is Bruce Babbitt. Bruce Babbitt, as I'm sure you know, is former governor of Arizona. Oh, first is Kitzhaber. I'll introduce you first, but he will go first. How's that? Okay. First, I will introduce Bruce Babbitt, who will go second. He was governor of Arizona, He's spent a lot of time in Oregon. He's climbed Mount Hood, and he's gone fishing with the man on his right, John Kitzhaber, and he is very close to our state. You may recall that when Bruce Babbitt ran for president in 1988, at the time he withdrew from the race, the ever-popular Babbitt said to the press, "You're not going to have Bruce Babbitt to puff up anymore." Well, we'll do just a little bit more puffing here. Bruce Babbitt went on to serve as Secretary of the Interior from 1993 to year 2000. During his tenure at the Department of Interior, Secretary Babbitt initiated a new direction in American conservation history: the development of large-scale, consensus-based environmental restoration projects. Currently, Secretary Babbitt continues to be a strong advocate for the environment and for protection of our lands and our wildlife, and he is also a director of the World Wildlife Fund. Speaking first, introduced second, is John Kitzhaber. John Kitzhaber, as it turns out, was a fish in a former life. He was not a bottom fish, he was a steelhead fish, probably, and he's still willing to swim upstream. Our own John Kitzhaber served as Oregon governor from 1995 to year 2003. He's been closely involved with natural resource issues in Oregon and the West during his entire public career. He took the lead on Columbia River management issues. His administration developed and implemented the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds as a way to involve local communities in the recovery of threatened and endangered salmon runs. In his current life, John Kitzhaber is involved in the Archimedes movement, which is a plan to jumpstart the reform of the American healthcare system. But his most important job is being Logan's dad. We'll begin with John Kitzhaber.
Thank you very much. I'm actually buying time for the Secretary to finish his speech here. He gets the last word, so. William Jennings Bryan once said that destiny is not a matter of chance, it's a matter of choice. It's not a thing to be waited for, it's a thing to be achieved. And I'd like you to keep those words in mind during my remarks this morning because they capture the message that I hope to convey to you today. The issue of dam removal is not a new one here in the Pacific Northwest, nor has it become less controversial with time. Indeed, over the past few years, it has acquired almost a life of its own, and to some extent, it has become a debate more about symbols than about solutions. On the environmental side, dams are symbols of man's subjugation of the mighty Columbia River and of the ecological degradation that has resulted from that. And thus, removal of the dams becomes an end in itself, set apart from the overall effect on salmon or watershed restoration. On the other side, the dams are symbols of the very real economic benefits that have flowed from taming this great river. And thus, their removal threatens the economic interest because it legitimizes a discussion of the environmental cost with which these economic benefits have been purchased. What I'd like to do this morning is to try to cast this debate in a larger context and to suggest that what is at stake here goes far beyond the issue of salmon and dams and the regional economy. To me, it raises the question of whether we have the courage and will to reconcile the growing contradiction between the world we say we want to leave our children and the one we're actually building through the decisions that we're making each day. And it calls into question our capacity to take explicit and intentional action to shape our future rather than simply reacting to circumstances and thus, by default, allowing it to become a matter of chance. Now, it seems to me that the central question is not whether or not we breach these lower Snake River dams. The real question is much more fundamental. Do we as a region want to restore the health of the Columbia River ecosystem? Now, I'm going to assume, for argument's sake, that the answer to that question is yes. Why? Because a functioning ecosystem, one that can provide for the needs of animals and humans, demonstrates our willingness to live our lives in a sustainable fashion, a willingness to take the legacy that we have been handed and pass it on intact to the next generation of Westerners. But if our salmon runs are not healthy, then our watersheds are not healthy. And if our watersheds are not healthy, it speaks to our ecosystem and also the fact that we are putting at risk our future and the future of our children and our grandchildren. A highly degraded ecosystem, which is where we are headed today, represents at best an implicit decision to mortgage the legacy with which we have been blessed for our own short-term economic benefits. And I believe that we're better than that. Sometimes it's easier to see where we need to go if we take time to reflect on where we've been. So let's review a little history. The origins of this conflict date back to the western expansion of our nation in the 19th century, an expansion that was actively supported by federal policies. The Homestead Act of 1862, for example, signed by Abraham Lincoln, gave away 270 million acres to settlers who wanted to move into the West. Now, whereas in the 19th century, settlers were lured into the West by this seemingly inexhaustible supply of land, in the 20th century, the focus and the lure shifted to water, starting with the 1902 Reclamation Act that set the stage for these huge western water projects, one of the first of which was the Klamath Project, constructed in 1905. In 1928, Congress authorized the Boulder Canyon Project that led to Hoover Dam, and between 1938 and 1976, no fewer than 29 dams were built in the Columbia River Basin, 25 on the main stem, and these 4 on the lower Snake River. Now, at the time these policies were put into place, they made sense. They were defensible. They helped advance a larger national purpose. It was a time of perceived abundance, a time of expanding horizons. And no one could possibly have imagined that the resources of this vast nation might be exhausted, or that there could be a dark side to the very significant and real economic benefits that resulted to this region and to its people. But by the late 1960s, it was becoming increasingly clear that the economic benefits of development and unfettered natural resource extraction did come at a price. These activities were having a detrimental impact on our environment. And we responded by passing the landmark environmental legislation of the 1970s, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. In 1980, 7 years after the passage of the ESA, Congress created the Northwest Power Planning Council, which, among other things, was charged with developing a fish and wildlife program to protect, to mitigate, and to enhance the fish and wildlife species that had been harmed by the federal hydroelectric system. What that amounted to was an explicit recognition of the environmental damage that was flowing from the dams and from the way we were operating them. Nonetheless, 11 years later, in 1991, the Snake River sockeye salmon were listed under the Endangered Species Act, and spring and fall Chinook were listed the following year. So in response to the Snake River listings, the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS, produced a biologic opinion in 1993 that directed the BPA and the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation on how to operate these dams and the system in a way that would not compromise the fish. NMFS was subsequently sued by both Oregon and Idaho on the grounds that the opinion was inadequate. In 1994, Judge Marsh agreed with the ruling and concluded that NMFS was more concerned with what the hydro system could absorb without adversely affecting the economic interests on the river rather than with what the fish really needed in order to survive. In 1995, 1 year later, NMFS put some interim steps in place and promised to produce another biologic opinion by 1999, another 5-year delay. Predictably, public focus shifted to the question of breaching the dams, not the main stem dams, but the 4 earthen dams that provide the inland waterway from the Columbia River inland to Lewiston, Idaho. With the promised 1999 NMFS opinion still pending, I entered this debate in my second term as governor in a speech that I gave on February of 2000 to the Oregon chapter of the American Society of Fisheries, in which I said, if we can move beyond the symbolism of the 4 Snake River dams and look at the policy trade-offs involved, and at the other choices we must make if we choose to leave them intact, breaching emerges as a responsible and cost-effective option. It is not the only option, but it is a responsible one that should not be dismissed out of hand. There is no doubt that we can move ahead with salmon recovery without breaching the dams. All I am saying to you is that we have to stop deluding ourselves into thinking that our choices will be easier or cheaper if we just leave the dams alone. I will work with the political leadership in the region to pursue either path, but we must choose and act, because in all of this, delay is our enemy. A month later, at the National Governors Association meeting in Washington, D.C., I met with the governors of Washington and Idaho and Montana to discuss where we might find common ground on this issue. And while they insisted that any recovery strategy must leave the dams intact, they did embrace a very aggressive non-breaching strategy to intensify efforts in other areas. And that commitment was reflected in a document that we released in July of 2005 called the Recommendation of the Governors of Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington for the Protection and Restoration of Fish in the Columbia River Basin. Then the long-awaited NMFS biologic opinion was produced in December of 2000, and it recommended a very similar strategy that was estimated to cost $900 million a year in order to fully implement. Less than half of that money was ever appropriated. And as a consequence, the National Wildlife Federation sued NMFS in May of 2001 on the grounds that the plan was inadequate to protect salmon, let alone to recover them. Subsequently, in May of 2003, this biologic opinion was also rejected, this time by Judge Redden, who concluded in essence that many of the recommendations were vague, that there wasn't enough money to implement it, and in some cases there was not even the authority to do so. NMFS, to its everlasting credit, then produced yet another biologic opinion in 2004, which, as astounding as it may sound, attempted to get around the bothersome problem of the dams by redefining them as part of the natural environment. To no one's great surprise, Judge Redden rejected this opinion as well in June of last year. So, here we are, 15 years after the first species were listed on the Snake River. We still have neither a legal biologic opinion nor a recovery plan for these embattled fish. Although another 12 species of salmon and steelhead and bull trout have been listed in the intervening years. What should we conclude from this charade? Well, to me, the answer is clear. The choices that we must face if we are really committed to restoring the health of the Columbia River ecosystem, will not be made cheaper or easier by simply leaving the dams intact. We are inundated with studies that confirm that fact. And while partisans and the press can focus on the differences in these studies, the conclusions and the information that are common to virtually all of them are very significant. First, any successful effort to recover salmon and restore a functioning ecosystem must address not only the harm caused by the hydroelectric system, but also the harm caused by degraded habitat, by unscientific hatchery practices, and by outdated harvest policies. Second, removing the 4 lower Snake River dams is, at least for the Snake River salmon listed under the Endangered Species Act, the single most beneficial action we can take. And third, if we decide not to remove the 4 lower Snake River dams, we will need to do more and with greater intensity in the other areas of hatcheries, habitat, and harvest to achieve our stated objective of recovering the health of this ecosystem. Now, if you think about it, in essence, the 2000 NMFS biologic opinion shifted the responsibility for recovery from the hydroelectric system to the other 4 H's, habitat, harvest, and hatcheries. But since we subsequently failed either to adequately fund these efforts or to aggressively pursue their implementation, it should come as no great surprise to the political establishment here in the Northwest, or to the administration, or to anyone in the region, that the debate is shifting back again to dam breaching. My point is this: if, as a region, we take consideration of dam removal off the table as a point of legitimate discussion, then we must be willing to either make the financial and political investments necessary to aggressively deal with the other areas, or admit that we are not really willing to restore this ecosystem to health. We can't have it both ways. I could accept that conclusion, as disappointing as it might be, if it were a conscious choice. If we had thoughtfully weighed the economic risks and the environmental risks and concluded that we were simply not willing to pay the price. But that is not what we were doing here. We are deciding by not deciding. Which brings us back to the question I posed at the beginning of my remarks. Do we, in fact, still have the capacity to take explicit and intentional actions to shape our own future, or have we simply resigned ourselves to allowing it by default to become a matter of chance? Now, this question is not just limited to the issue of the ecosystem here in the Columbia River Basin. Deciding by not deciding has become a default position which allows us to avoid confronting many of the challenges that face us today. And we see it playing out all around us. We see it in our stubborn refusal to seriously look beyond an economy built on fossil fuel to one based on clean, renewable sources of energy, thus steadily increasing our dependence on some of the most politically unstable parts of the world, even as the price, the human and environmental and economic price of producing a barrel of oil continues to increase. We see it in the crisis in our healthcare system through our unwillingness to challenge its underlying structure, a structure that's based on assumptions that are no longer valid, thus shackling us to a point in the middle of the last century. Now, what do all these things have in common? What do they have in common? They are all problems that flow from decisions that were made in the last century. Decisions which at the time made sense and which were made in an effort to make the world a better place for us. And in many ways they did, and we should never lose sight of that fact. The Columbia River hydroelectric system has brought enormous benefits to the people of the Pacific Northwest. Fossil fuel and the internal combustion engine has built us an economy and a standard of living unparalleled in the world. Medicare and Medicaid and our system of employer-sponsored coverage has made health care accessible to millions and millions of Americans. But ironically, these policies and the programs through which we seek to implement them now actually threaten our future and the future of our children. Albert Einstein once said, "You should not use an old map to explore a new world." And he was right, because each new generation faces a new world with new challenges, challenges that cannot be met by clinging to the past, but only by imagining a different world and a different set of tools by which to build it. My grandmother was born in 1895, before the Industrial Revolution and 8 years before Orville and Wilbur Wright showed us that man could fly, in itself a pretty remarkable leap of imagination. But before she died in 1974, she watched Neil Armstrong step into history and onto the surface of the moon. How could her parents possibly have prepared her for changes of that magnitude? So the lesson here is that the tools our parents use to create a better world for us are not always up to the challenges that face a new generation. So it's critical that we give ourselves permission and create a space where we can actually ask, if anything were possible, what would we do to solve these challenges? What new tools would we need? And how much is it going to cost? Our failure to make any significant progress in the Columbia River Basin over the past 15 years, in spite of the investment of around $8 billion, is due largely to our inability to imagine a different future and a different way to get there. Every stakeholder in the region has been an advocate or an opponent of any particular recovery strategy based on their belief of whether or not it will adversely impact them from an economic standpoint. These competing economic interests, then, have managed to effectively block any serious consideration of a solution out of fear that if a particular strategy is even discussed, it increases the likelihood that it might happen. We can do better than that. We can do better than that. To move forward on this issue, we must be willing to explicitly answer three questions. First, what are the elements of a plan that give us the best possible chance to restore and maintain the ecologic health of this region? A discussion in which nothing should be left off the table. Second, what are the costs involved to mitigate the real economic impact that such a strategy will certainly have on some stakeholders in the region? Let's make the politics and costs explicit. And third, are we willing to pay those costs? Now, at the end, we may say no. We may say that the cost of leaving a healthy, functioning ecosystem to our children and grandchildren is simply not worth the price. I would like to think that's not the case, but in any event, it would be an honest choice, and that is a far, far cry from what we are doing today. Delay is not some benign, prudent placeholder. It is a choice. It is a choice to abandon this ecosystem on which we all depend. To quote Theodore Roosevelt, probably the greatest environmental steward to serve as president, unless Bruce Babbitt had made it, he said, "In any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing, The worst thing you can do is nothing. Thank you.
Well, let me begin by saying I share your enthusiasm for your former governor. And I must tell you, we are great friends, but it didn't really start out that way. I remember at the end of the first Clinton administration, I got a call one day from the White House, and they said the president is very eager to go to Portland for a large rally. He has only one day available, and we called the governor of Oregon, and he said, I'm unavailable on that day. And they said, would you call Governor Kitzhaber and see what the problem is? So I called your governor, and he said, well, I've scheduled a trip to fish for steelhead on the Deschutes River. Now, I actually got over that. And about a year later, I was scheduled to come out to Portland for another function, and I thought, well, I'll try my luck again. I'll just check in and see what's going on. And I got hold of Governor Kitzhaber, and I said, I'm going to be in Portland on this, it was a day in May, on a Friday. I thought I might just drop by and say hello. He said, Bruce, I'm not going to be there. And I thought, well, okay, I know what a brush off is. But then he said, as if to rub it in, he said, I'm going to be on top of Mount Hood. And then he said, but you could join me on top of Mount Hood. And in the spirit of the times, I said, okay. And we, in fact, made it to the top of Mount Hood, whereupon we gradually formulated a relationship which has led us to some fishing expeditions in Steens Mountain, to a Jimmy Buffett concert in Portland. Well, enough. I think you get the drift of it. Let me say it's always an enormous pleasure to come back to this club. Your civility is something that's in very short supply these days. And as I watch you, discussing and holding up cards, I got to tell you, this could never happen in Arizona. So I'm always asked when why does Bruce Babbitt keep showing up in Oregon? Haven't we had enough of you? What's this all about? And there are a lot of strands to it, but really in my secretarial days, as I became acquainted with your state, I really did become mesmerized by this issue of salmon. I come from Arizona, I'm a Westerner, but I had never really seen anything quite like the way this fish permeates the history and the mythology and the culture and the reality of what it means to live in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm now kind of stuck to this issue. I'm beginning to understand it, and I share the incredible sense of mystery and mystique that surrounds this creature, some of which born 1,000 miles inland in a place called Redfish Lake at 7,000 feet elevation, making a journey out to circle in the depths of the Pacific off the Aleutian Islands, and then unerringly, at the appropriate time, finding their way back through the Columbia estuary, 1,000 miles inland, steering to the very trickling creek waters where they began that life cycle. I was actually brought down from my mysticism by a friend of mine who explained, he's actually a scientist, he said, well, it's a combination of olfactory and taste senses, and it's real simple. It's equivalent to the ability to taste a drop of vermouth in 1,000,000 barrels of gin. I said, okay, I understand. I want to leave you with a sense of the urgency of this issue. We've been grappling with it for 15 years now, and there are many who think it may go on indefinitely for generations. But I do think we're at a decision point. And I really saw that about 10 days ago when I saw an article on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in the upper left-hand column. Now, the Wall Street Journal is not a notable environmental organization. And the thrust of the story was that after 25 years of effort, the expenditure of $8 billion and an ongoing annual expenditure from the federal government and from outlays through the Bonneville Power Administration, some $700 million a year. The game is just about up because there is a rising sense, not only in the Northwest, but in the Congress, in all branches of government, that we simply can't continue spending money and throwing it down a rat hole. Now, I know that sounds harsh, but look at the facts. In the time that we've been spending this money, the Snake River coho salmon have become extinct. The sockeye salmon has become functionally extinct. And by that I mean that after the expenditure of $8 billion and $700 million a year, last year, 3 sockeye salmon made it to Redfish Lake. They were all hatchery fish. The wild fish are extinct. The Chinook, the spring-summer Chinook runs in the Snake River, the wild runs, are exactly where they were in 1992 when I took office as Secretary of the Interior. I have to agree with the Wall Street Journal. That's a pretty dismal record. There's no way we can keep justifying the expenditure of these kinds of sums for those kinds of results. People say, well, why the Snake River? What is it about the Snake River? Well, the Snake River is the last doorway into the Intermountain West. We've blocked all the rest of them. We've blocked off part with Hell's Canyon. We've blocked off the Upper Columbia with Grand Coulee. There's this one corridor left. And through that corridor, once traveled 50%. Only 4 salmon stocks, but the numbers about 50% of our wild salmon because of the habitat value. It's about 70% of the salmon habitat that's left is accessed through that bottleneck running up through the Snake River. And what we've learned after spending all this money is that the problem is the 4 dams on the Snake River. That's indisputable. It's being disputed. There are still scientists who will say global warming is just a theory. The Earth may still be flat. And we can still deny that these dams are the problems. But the facts are out there. I won't elaborate them. They were running pretty well until we built these. The salmon managed to make it up over the 4 big dams on the Columbia, and by and large, diminished levels, but satisfactory levels back down. These dams came on in the 60s and 70s, just like that. Mostly downstream migration, problems, not exclusively. And we have spent billions of dollars trying to rationalize our way around the reality of those dams, reconfiguring them, tinkering with the spillways. trucking the fish, barging the fish. You know, we put the grain on the river and we take the fish out and put them on the land. And the fact is, it isn't working. The dams are the problem. And we've now reached this point where the game is going to be over because of the restlessness in Congress and the country. And that $600 or $700 million a year is going to be gone. That will be a death sentence for the Snake River salmon. The game will be all over at that point because the expenditures will dwindle away as people simply throw up their hands. It won't be 100% extinction. There'll still be, the hatcheries will still be churning fish out, and you know, we can sort of keep Idaho, the Grand Ronde River, the Wallowa Mountains, eastern Oregon, as, you know, kind of a third-rate fish farm with, you know, a few hatchery fish struggling around in the rivers, but the magic and the mystery and the mystique of a wild ecosystem will pretty much be gone. There is an alternative, but we don't have much time to deal with it. The alternative is simply to say, what can we do with that $600 million? And how can we use that to make an offer to all of the economic interests? We'll hold you harmless. And we'll make investments that will make it possible both to remove the dams, restore the salmon, and encourage economic progress and hold everyone harmless. The first issue is agriculture, and it's an important one. The farmers up there are living on the margin. It's tough. And they have concerns. They say, you know, take our grain off the river, we'll be at the mercy of the BNSF railway. No farmer in American history has ever gone to sleep thinking that the railroads are going to treat them fairly. No doubt about that. Well, what do we do? Well, let's think about that $600 million a year, $700 million, in terms of making an investment to do two things. Let's make an offer to all the farmers in eastern Washington. First of all, let's invest $1 billion in infrastructure. That would, amortizing infrastructure investments, would be $100 million a year to upgrade the rail system in eastern Washington to make it a real asset for that region, for farmers, for the future of mass transit and development. And then make an offer to the farmers in eastern Washington. We'll hold you harmless against any rate increases that the railroads may impose over the baseline that you're paying at a subsidized rate on those barges on the river. We'll hold you harmless. Invite the farming community to structure the deal. What would it cost? Maybe $20, $25 million a year, penny or two a bushel. $25 million a year. Let's subtract that from the $600 million that we're spending now. Okay, we've got, and the debt service on the infrastructure to have a really class one railroad, short line railroad system. Yeah, we'd still have $500 million left to sort of paint an alternative future. Some of it for other investments ongoing in the system, but still a lot of money left with which to then turn to the next interest group, and I have a feeling that they're here in the audience today. Anybody here from the Northwest Power Planning Council or the electrical users? Only one? Only one. Let me see if I can, just quickly wrapping up, state your objection. You're saying, but the Snake River dams generate electricity, renewable electricity. True, they generate hydropower. It's about 5% of the power on the Bonneville grid. It's about 2% of the power that's used in the Pacific Northwest. It's not peaking power, it's run-of-the-river power. 5%. And the question I would ask you is, do you really want to preserve that margin of power and sacrifice the wild salmon of the inland west? Is that the price you want to pay? why don't we take a couple $100 million of this annual flow we've got and say to the power kings of the Northwest, we'd like to invest that in alternative energy and in conservation. And we'd like the Northwest Power Planning Council to present a plan to show us how to do it, not to object, but to show us the price of filling in that 5% gap with conservation and renewable energy. And you got a couple $100 million to do it, not new money. We'll use the money that's currently being spent and which will be gone in the very near future. Mark my words. People aren't going to continue to support failure at the national level. They will surely support redeploying these resources for success. So, in summation, we really are finally now at the hour of decision. And I think what we have to do is talk to our political leaders, in particular in the Northwest, and say to them as follows. The game is almost up. You can't hide any longer by saying we'll appropriate more money so that people can waste it, making all these fixes that we've been doing for 25 years to no effect. You can't hide any longer. That game is up. You've got to tell us your position, because there are only two alternatives left. One is to acquiesce in the default position, which is let it go. We'll lose both the revenue stream and wild salmon in the inland west. Or to say we can get together and make a fresh start, acknowledge that the dams are the problems, that we can hold the economic interests harmless, and chart a new course in the Pacific Northwest. Thanks.
Thank you both very much. Our first question today will be asked by board host Marge Kafori. Marge serves on the Board of Governors of City Club and on the board of Portland Center Stage. She's also a member of the City Club Program Committee, and she's former Director of Government Relations for the City of Portland. Marge.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Governor and Mr. Secretary, for speaking to us this afternoon and sharing your views about this very important subject. My question is this. The Snake River dams are decades old, and each is about 100 feet high, as I understand it, and there are 4 of them. If the dams are breached, what happens to all the silt that has been built up behind them, and what happens to the fish when that silt is released by the dams? And that question is for either one of you.
Good question. Had I been answering that question 10 years ago, I would have told you we don't really know, because as recently as about 10 to 15 years ago, the idea of breaching a dam was so strange and unfamiliar that people would have said you're crazy to talk about it. Dams are, they're like the pyramids of Egypt. They're there in eternity. Fortunately, we now have some very good experience. About 100 dams, maybe closer to 200, have come down across the country based on these sort of economic and environmental balancing tests. And what we learned is this. There is a sediment problem. It's likely in these 4 dams to be mostly in the top dam at lower granite, because that's where the water first starts to slow down. The sediment issues are typically handled by not just tearing everything down at once, but by lowering the dam levels. I think what you would do here is probably start from the bottom up. and then let the water erode down. What we've learned, particularly at the Edwards Dam on the Kennebec River in Maine and in some of the California dams, if you do it correctly, you don't get big wedges of sediment coming downstream, and the fish do fine. The bottom line is the speed with which fish return after dam breaching is an unassailable, universal fact from the Neuse River in North Carolina to the Kennebec River in Maine to Butte Creek in California. It's part of that big miracle. They do fine navigating the remaining artificial rapids, if you will, created by a progressive dam removal.
Okay, privilege of membership in the City Club is to ask a question. A question in this context takes 30 seconds or less, ends with a question mark, and is not a speech. We'll begin with Chris, and then we'll alternate microphones.
Chris Smith, City Club member. Question for Governor Kitzhaber. Governor, I was struck when you said we have to make the costs and the politics explicit. My visceral reaction was, well, none of our politics are explicit. I'm tempted to ask you how to fix all our politics, but I'll restrain myself and say, in this case, how do we make the politics explicit and honest and get around all the positioning and grandstanding?
Well, I think, let me come up there. Okay.
That's on.
Trying to save time here. I think Bruce really laid out essentially what I was talking about. If you remove the dams, there are certain costs that you know you're going to incur. If you're a farmer, you're going to have to extend your pipes. You're going to have higher pumping costs. You have transportation issues, which he raised. There are issues with the economy of the inland port of Lewiston, Idaho. The question is to quantify those and give yourself permission to say, how could we creatively take the same money and create a win-win situation? How could we make investments that hold those economic interests harmless, but also have a larger regional benefit, such as upgrading the short-line railroad system? So it's a matter of not pretending that there aren't politics and economics, but creating a venue where you can actually talk about them and say, we know that they're there, we recognize why you're concerned about it. Now let's talk about how we can get beyond that and keep you whole in a different paradigm. That's what I mean by giving ourselves permission to imagine what a different future might look like. And I think Bruce really laid out one scenario through which you could achieve that.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. Back in 1953, my wife and I came to Oregon from Italy. And the friend that got us here told us, don't worry about turning off the lights. Well, here we are 50 years later. I have almost forgotten, but my wife keeps me reminding of turning off the lights. I think the time for us is really to cut back our overconsumption. Are we prepared to do it? I like very much what Governor Babbitt said about the railroads. It's time to invest again in alternatives.
There's no question that we have, right in this room, the capacity to significantly reduce the power demand in the region by choices that we make every day. During the few months when we had the, now as we realize, trumped-up energy crisis at the late, in 2000, Governor Locke and I encouraged citizens of both Oregon and Washington to take voluntary conservation measures, and we reduced energy consumption probably more than that 2% we were talking about. And I think you could take some of those resources and provide additional investments for homes to move to solar, for encouraging green building practices. I mean, there are a whole host of options that don't just deal with this particular issue, but move us further ahead in terms of the goal of energy independence. And I think people need both the financial incentives to do it, but the political leadership to allow them to think about that as a realistic possibility for the future.
Steve Novick, City Club member. Mr. Secretary, a general environmental policy question. Yesterday, our Republican candidate for governor, Ron Saxton, said that government doesn't need to protect the environment, the free market will take care of it. Could you speculate for us on what America would look like today if Richard Nixon had not signed the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, or how the bald eagle would be doing if the government had not banned DDT but had left things up to the market?
I agree with you.
Rick York, I'm a City Club member, and I have a question that goes a little deeper, but it does direct itself to both of you. Given that there are viable alternatives in the Snake River, there are also viable alternatives for the environment throughout the region. Where is the political leadership? And I don't mean leadership like yours, which is essentially preaching to the choir, but leadership which, like Tom McCall, will go out to the people and teach and learn from them what's needed.
Steve? I think that's a very valid question, but I guess I want to turn it back on us. I think we do lack political leadership to some extent, but also our politics in this state and in this country have become very transactional. Now think about it. Lower my taxes and I'll vote for you. Don't drill in Anwar and I'll vote for you. Take out the dams and I'll vote for you. Don't take out the dams and I'll vote for you. Those transactions are all about me. They have nothing to do with us. They're about what I can get, not what I can give. And they don't foster any sense of common purpose. And that's really what we need. And ultimately, I think it has to come from us. And you knew I was going to get this in sooner or later. But what we're trying to do with the Archimedes movement is trying to create an alternative space for civic engagement where people can begin to imagine what that alternative future looks like. Because if we can't come together on the vision of what we want it to look like, we're not going to get there. The Roman Senator Seneca said, if no wind is the right wind if you don't know what port you're sailing for. And basically what we're talking about in the context of this noon's discussion is what would that alternative future look like if we were to remove those dams, if we were to take the other steps we need for a healthy functioning ecosystem. And that imagination has to come from us. It has to come from us. It's not going to be handed to us by somebody else.
Kurt Wavering, member. I'd like to know where our governors and congressional representatives and senators are on this issue, and let's see, where do you find some leadership in your direction?
Well, I'm pleading ignorance of the politics of the Pacific Northwest, and Governor Kitzhaber has told me I should answer the question. So.
I have the same question. Yeah.
I don't want to sound harsh, because frankly, I have been in office, and when I was in office, I was part of the problem. I mean, I think our administration made some progress, but I'm not holding us up as a paragon of virtue on this one. What we have created is a culture of avoidance. And I think I can safely say that the position of much of the leadership in the Northwest is we don't have to make a decision. We are authorizing and supporting generous appropriations which will give us the appearance of caring. And if you're really incensed about this, maybe we'll go back and ask for a little more money. And we'll come back and say, we've just appropriated some more money. Because it's a very comfortable kind of position. And we'll have another study. And we don't have to make a decision. That's not an unheard of a kind of way of going about politics. And it's carried us through 25 years. It isn't going to work much longer. In answer to your question, I don't know where most of the leaders in the Northwest are because they haven't been required to answer the question. And I think that's really our job from now on, is to say, look, come on, let's quit all the kidding. We got two choices. If we just keep doing the same, they're gone, and the money will be gone as well. Taxpayers around the country are sick and tired of it. They'll deauthorize the Bonneville expenditures and the direct federal expenditures. The alternative is to say, yes, we should get serious about examining the economics, something we've never done of dam removal. I think John made the point in his speech. He said, people don't want to address the specifics because they're afraid it's a confession that they might acquiesce in a different kind of result. But that's where we got to get. Got to invite the farmers in and say, design a hold harmless plan. Invite the electrical utility people in and the Bonneville people in and say, design a gap-fulfilling alternative energy program. Let's put a price on it. Enough.
Fred Mathis, I'm a member, also a farm owner in Garfield County, Washington. And I was interested in the Secretary's talk about the railroads. And my question is, if this ever came about, that they would put the tracks back into Pomeroy and other small towns, do you think there's ever a chance that there would be reestablishment of passenger service?
Yes. You all heard the question. Well, it's a great question because this issue of railroad upgrades would appear to most people in eastern Washington, which was once crisscrossed with these short line railroads, most of which are in deplorable condition, many of which nothing left except the right-of-way. Rebuilding those is perceived as, just an offset for wheat farmers to market. But it's a region in transition. The population of eastern Washington is being discovered, much like many parts of eastern Oregon. And we're going to have 100 million more people in this country by 2050. Most of them are going to have the mobility to go to places where it's really nice to live. And these places are going to feel that kind of population increase. The agricultural economy of eastern Washington is also going to undergo some transition into different kinds of crops, specialty crops, diversification. And what that means to me is that we begin to think of railroad investments as infrastructure for many uses and many purposes in an expanding and growing region of the country, which in many cases will eventually merge into passenger transit. Maybe not tomorrow, but you can see it beginning to happen, certainly in California and in the Pacific Corridor. And so the answer to my answer to your question is yes. I may not be around, but he will.
I'm sorry to say we're out of time, but I'd like you to join me in thanking Governor Kitzhaber and Secretary Babbitt. And thank you all for coming today. Thanks to our radio and TV audience for your interest in City Club, and we are adjourned.
Thanks a lot.